All right, so good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second edition of our series that we're calling Board Talk. We're delighted to be here again this week, and Board Talk was conceived essentially to address the issue of diversity and corporate governance. As many of us know, board diversity enhances board quality, as it brings together directors who have different backgrounds, different skill sets, different opinions, and therefore look at problems in different ways. But despite the fact that we know that diversity in the boardroom is a good thing for business, it has been improving at a glacial pace. So it's improving, but very slowly. And as a result, here we are. I'm personally thrilled to be doing this with the support and partnership of the NACD, the National Association of Corporate Directors. The NACD's mission, for those of you who don't know, is to advance outstanding board leadership. And sorry, turning the sound up. Sorry, we had a technical difficulty. Sorry, the NACD's mission is to advance outstanding board leadership, and it's also to advocate for the profession of directorship. The NACD looks at various issues associated with corporate governance and publishes and does seminars that discuss these critical issues, and diversity is definitely one of them. We're also doing this series on the Mosh platform, and Mosh is a new digital platform. It's a digital media platform that has been designed to engage on various issues for any brand or organization. And today I am so delighted to welcome Rakhi Kumar as our guest. And let me just briefly tell you about Rakhi before we jump into our conversation. She is the managing director and head of ESG, that's environmental, social, and governance investments and asset stewardship at State Street Global Advisors. And for those of you who don't know, I think they are the third largest asset manager in the world and a significant shareholder in a variety of companies. Rakhi leads their efforts to strengthen the integration of ESG into the investment process, and she's responsible for developing the firm's ESG investment philosophy and supporting the investment teams with the design and the development of the ESG investment products. She's developed and implemented new corporate governance, sustainability, ESG, and portfolio performance screening tools. She's also the ESG, well, she's the chair of State Street Global Advisors ESG Investment Working Group and is a member of their senior leadership team, Global Proxy Review Committee, International Class Action Committee, ESG Business Working Group, and the State Street Corporate Responsibility Working Group. She's also a member of the Council of Institutional Investors, Corporate Governance Advisory Council, and has been named in 2016 by the NACD in their Directorship 100, which is the annual list of the most influential people in the boardroom and in corporate governance. If that's not enough, she has an MBA from Yale and a Bachelor of Commerce from Bombay University. And we are thrilled to have you with us, Rakhi. Welcome, and I look forward to our conversation. And I will jump right in, actually, with the first question, because I do believe you have a lot of interesting information to share with us. So I want to just talk generally at first about board diversity. We have seen it definitely, as I said, move from the why. So we know it's important. We know it means good business, improved results. And now we're at the how. How do we get there? How do we improve the situation? And the question is, how do we improve the situation, but also why is it taking so long?
Yeah, thanks, Patricia. And first, I want to say thank you very much for having me as a guest, and also a shout out to NACD, who we think does really good work in this space and has really put out some good literature and thought leadership on key ESG issues. With regards to the question of why is it taking so long, and I agree with you. If you ask directors today, is gender diversity or diversity of any sort on the board important? The answer is always yes. So the question is, why has it taken long? And I think part of that is some boards, not all. Some boards have not prioritized the diversity or making their boards more diverse as one of the goals as part of the nomination and onboarding process. And the second bit is the whole nominations process. If you think about how some boards are finding directors, it's the same way they were finding directors 20 years ago, which is let's look at our network and find candidates. Male networks have male candidates and female networks have more female candidates. And I think that's one of the concerns that we've identified. And I think we really need to focus a bit more on what the nomination process is at companies, and also how does the nomination process really help bring about, or it starts from a good skills matrix as well as a background of what you're looking for, and then using that knowledge to go outside your network and use different channels to find good directors. So I'll stop there and see if you have any questions.
Well, yeah, I was going to talk about the way that directors are found, and it was recently shown, I forget who did the research, but they are, most of the time it is through either the board's network or a trusted advisors network. So say a lawyer or the auditor, and actually search, and this is not a plug in any way, is used about 30% of the time. And that's still the case in spite of the fact that we are seeing, such slow improvement on these metrics. So any more thoughts on that? I mean, why they're still going to this?
Yeah, and I think.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, and I think what data you've shared with us is probably something we see in our conversations with boards. So one of the questions we've been asking over time when it comes to diversity is, how did you find your candidate? And everyone says, oh, we used a search firm, but eventually this candidate was known to us. And I think part of the issue is what is important is collegiality, right? And the trust. And I don't think you can minimize the importance of that on a board. I think you want people but through your social network, or do you know as having a reputation and background that you need? And I think that is where it may be important for boards to understand some of the unconscious biases that may be existing within their search process.
Yeah, you want collegiality, but not too much, right?
Right. So you want constructive dialogue and not collegiality with the idea that let's sign off, let's make sure that we all agree upon the same thing. And that is exactly what diversity is meant to break up, the fact that we think differently and we raise questions so that the outcomes are better.
Well, it's interesting because on this subject, and I will digress before I jump into another formal question, but on the idea of collegiality, even if the board starts off as not necessarily completely known to each other and collegial, the longer they spend together, the more collegial they become, which brings up the whole issue of independence, right? And the pressure now to look at tenure on boards. Any thoughts on that? Because, collegiality changes over time.
I absolutely agree. And that's human nature. Let's be honest. If I spend, 2 days with you, you and I will be far more collegial than if we just met, right? So I think that's something we need to recognize. And coming to your point on tenure, that's exactly one of the things that we have been looking at. So if I may, really go into our journey that we undertook when it comes to diversity, this is not a new topic for us. For us, we've been addressing diversity for years. It goes back to when I joined SSGA in 2011. And the journey was something like this. We talk to a company and say, what about diversity on your board? Oh, yes, absolutely. All for diversity. But there are no seats open right now. And so that happened for a few years. And then in 2014, we actually addressed this through a refreshment policy, what is now known as a tenure policy. But the objective of that was to get boards to focus on board refreshment practices and how they're bringing on new talent and diverse thought on the board. And the policy was really meant to promote refreshment, but also we didn't call out long tenure directors as ineffective. All we said is perhaps they're not independent because of the fact that they have been there for too long. And we've just asked them to step off key committees. So it's up to the board to decide if that individual is so effective that they would like for them to continue on as a director without role as a key committee, and that's something that we don't have insights into. So that was really the start of the journey. And then from there, we went on to then the conversation shifted to, yes, there are openings, but there are no women who really can satisfy all the needs, or we can't find them. And that's when we have gone into our latest guidance that we've put out on gender diversity.
And can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I know the same old story. It's not, I always tell people it's definitely not a supply problem. It is a demand problem because there is supply. So,
right.
Yeah. So how do you work around that? Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things that we have done, and I believe it's on your website, or it's available definitely on our website, and it's called SSG's Guidance on Enhancing Gender Diversity on Boards. And what we've done in that is we've really captured years' worth of engagement that we've had on this issue. And we've pointed out certain practices that have led to that create this environment where you can't find candidates. So for one example is we talked about the excessive reliance on your own network. Another example is where a must requirement is the director has to have former CEO experience. We know there are not that many female CEOs. So there itself, you're limiting your pool. And those who have been female CEOs are very, are needed. And they can get any board seats, and they may be close to being overboarded in some cases. They go to large cap companies, right? So how are you going to find it within your own network, or if you have that requirement? And then we talked about the fact that you don't have female leadership. So anecdotally, I've heard companies say that, once we had a few females, they started asking all these questions on gender, on pipeline issues, etc. And so having these champions on your board itself and in leadership positions that can push for more diversity. And I would say that's some of the things we've called out. But in addition, we've also looked at what the map is, like where are we on gender diversity? And what we found is that there was still 2% of S&P 500 companies, that's 10 companies in the S&P 500 who have no women. We found that there were 24% of Russell 3000 companies that had no women. That's close to about 600 plus companies. And if you look at the entire universe of the number of companies in the US that all listed companies in the US that do not have any women on the board, it's up to 35. And that's, I think, close to 5,000 companies in the US. Amazing. So you're really talking about significant number of companies. And then we also have provided a pathway or some guiding questions or activities that boards can undertake if they wish to enhance diversity on their board.
It's interesting going back to the supply and demand, and that's also interesting. Anecdotally, on my end, I have actually worked with companies in the UK bringing American women to sit on boards over there. And when I hear that we don't have them and over there, because they do have sort of a soft quota, the Lord Davies rule, they're bringing them from our country over there to sit on boards. So it's so interesting, when I hear, the supply issue. So I want to ask you a little bit about something that has been so much in the news lately, and it is a fearless girl that is here in New York, and want to hear, there's a lot of talk about her, and she's the new place that people are stopping in New York City to take photos. She's definitely become quickly an iconic symbol of women and, strong women and so on. And would love to hear a little bit about, how she came to be and State Street's idea about this. And, was the intention, to create so much buzz, and how do you feel about all of this?
Yeah. So yeah, thank you for that. So, the fearless girl really is something that has gone beyond what we could imagine. And it was conceived, I would say, not by me, but it was part of our marketing team. What we were doing in the fall really was looking at gender diversity, and the statistics that I talked about is part of that research that we were doing to establish policies and implement in our policies. At the same time, we knew the Women's Day was coming up in March, and last year on Women's Day we had actually launched a product which was focused on which had a gender diversity focus. And so what the Fearless Girl is meant to do is to really bring attention in a very physical way about the lack of gender diversity in boardrooms, in companies, and what better place to do that than New York City. And so it really is meant to once bring attention, but also talk about asset stewardship that is such an important part of the investment process here at SSGA.
So actually, I have a question. I want to sort of jump around a little and maybe come back to the Fearless Girl, who is so interesting in so many ways. But the question that I've received from one of the people listening and watching is going back to the supply and the women. And if you don't need former CEO experience, what other skills are valued? So I'd love to hear what you think. I have some thoughts, but want to hear from your point of view. What do you think besides CEO experience is important?
Yeah. So first, don't get me wrong. That is it good to have former CEOs on the board? Absolutely. But does every member have to be a former CEO? I don't think so. In terms of to answer the question, what other skills are important? It really depends on where the company's at. What we try to do at SSGA is to understand what the long-term strategy of the company is. And the board's job, I guess the board's role, the way we look at it, is to oversee the journey that the company is taking and to oversee management in its implementation of that strategy. So does the board really have those skills to be able to implement strategy? An example would be a company is going into a growth plan, which is based on M&A transactions, right? So you could find a person who you probably want skills of somebody who has done M&A, either an M&A lawyer or an M&A person who's worked in an M&A shop as an investment banker, and that's how we look at it. Another example could be you're going to cost cutting, right? And you want somebody who has run a business and has managed to turn it around or cost cut in a way which still keeps the long-term issues going. So that's a way of to be able to identify. It's not one particular skill. You have to match that skill to the company and where the company is at in terms of their long-term strategy.
And I think it also has to continue to evolve, because as the strategy evolves, the places that the company is going is changing, and the configuration and skill set that's needed around the boardroom table will also change, or it should at least. And another example is, for example, international experience. The company might already be in Asia, but might be moving to Africa, and they might need experience in that area. So I think you always have to look at where are you heading, where the board is, where the gaps are, and continually sort of evolve and change out, the skill sets, not every year, but, certainly regularly. I think also, every board obviously needs finance experience, social media experience. I'm seeing a lot, which brings in the younger generation into the boardroom. So younger people who are more sort of digital natives, millennials who have this kind of experience are in demand in some boards. So definitely some operators, but a lot of other types of people are needed as well, I think.
Right. That's true.
So in terms of, we were talking a little bit about, we're talking about how these people get into the boardroom and the diversity and all this, but, there's also the pipeline question. So we get our directors from usually the more senior level executives in organizations, and then we look back and say, okay, we don't have women CEOs. What about this pipeline? What can we do to actually fill the pipeline so that we eventually do have, more diverse candidates, be them CEOs or any of these other skills to put, into the boardroom? So any thoughts about the pipeline issue?
Yes, and I think the pipeline issue is actually far more challenging because it's a long-term issue. You don't build a pipeline overnight, right? You can, in some ways, find find board members within a year, but a pipeline takes longer. And so really it starts with knowing where you are at. And that means actually tracking the number of how much diversity you have at each level of management. studying why these numbers fluctuate, and most firms at the base level have probably a lot of gender parity. And then when they start increasing in terms of levels, it starts falling off. And I think asking the question of what is it about our firm that, one, it's just normal, but what can we do to retain the women, right? Also having goals. So I've had a lot of back and forth with firms about setting goals, because it's really challenging, right, about setting goals and not meeting them, because you do eventually want to find the right candidate. And if that's a man, it doesn't mean, and should you be choosing a woman over a man just because she's a woman? That's not what we're all trying to achieve. That's just not where we're going. So I think, but aspiration goals are helping provide that North Star that the firm wants to go to, and it's aspirational. And I think that's one of the reasons, and this has to be long-term in nature. So I think that's one of the things that when it comes to pipeline development, it's a lot of work. It starts with disclosure and acknowledging where you want to go. And then it comes to making cultural change that may be needed, giving a lot of training internally that may be needed to help build that pipeline.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it also goes back all the way to, education of young girls, right? And just sort of teaching them in different ways and to have different aspirations. But it also brings me to the next question, and that's, you talk a little bit about the challenges of balancing, work and family, and that's definitely been seen as a barrier to reaching the executive levels, and then obviously the levels necessary to become a director. So any thoughts on that? I mean, I think, mid-career women, for example, sometimes they opt out and they don't get back in. And, the old leaning in, is that enough? I mean, is that whole idea enough? And what do we do about that as women?
Yeah, and I mean, it's really interesting. So I think this work-life balance question, I think it still has a gender implication to it. But as we're going through a generational transition, I think work-life balance is going to be an issue for every organization if they don't address it now, because there are many men who actually want work-life balance too. And you see that happening with the introduction of paternity leave. You see that happening with longer vacation days or weeks of vacation, additional weeks of vacation, and the minimum 2 weeks that some firms offer as ways to attract talent. Right. And the generation, I look at the work-life balance as two. One, what the firm can do, and one, what we as women can do internally to help ourselves. Right. And I think from a firm perspective, there are many firms who are trying to attract women who have left the workforce or bring back and be the place where women who have left the workforce to come back again. There's some who offer multiple or flexible work hours, flexible work days for a few years to retain that talent in the pipeline. So that's what the firms can do. But I think women and people also have a responsibility in bringing that work-life balance. And part of that also stems from making decisions about the commuting time, and about how long you're going to compromising on the house, on the big house. So that you're closer to work and you spend less time commuting and you're with your kid sooner. And you've seen these trends start up. So I think, and it's the first few years of parenting, because I'm a new parent myself, and it's really challenging in the first few years. So I think, being kind to yourself and recognizing their limitations, and you don't have to move into the best school district at age 0. Is good, and you have 5 years to move into that school district, and you can live probably close to home in a small shoebox if need be. But I think those are the kinds of things we also have to, as women, recognize.
I think you hit on a very important point, and that's being kind to oneself and managing our own sort of competitive perfection kind of expectations that many of us have, right? I think letting go
Right.
of the need to be perfect in both areas, home and work, goes a long way. I think you also need to be creative about how you can do it all and have it all, right? So
Right.
I wanted to ask you a question that came in from listeners. So it's, what do you think about quotas, the big word quotas in either the executive ranks, which is interesting, or in the board, around the boardroom table and in the boardroom?
Yeah. So I've actually not been a fan of quotas. I think that quotas will may have unintended consequences. And my best example here is a shareholder proposal at Urban Outfitters, which did not have any women on the board. And that shareholder proposal was passed. It received majority support by shareholders, and guess who the founder put on? His wife. And that was not exactly what shareholders were looking for. And if I use that example and say, okay, if we do have quotas, what they're going to fill these quotas, and what are they going to do? And so then they're going to find some women, and the board sizes may increase, and the ineffectiveness or the effectiveness of what we're trying to achieve, which is strong, effective, independent boards, may be compromised because of the quota system. So I know there's no perfect answer. I know there are many ways, but one of the other things I'm concerned about as a shareholder who does believe in having strong, independent, effective boards is that if we don't do anything ourselves, it's going to come, right? The quotas will come. We've seen that happen in Europe. We've seen that happen in countries like India. And I think that if we're smart about it, we recognize it and address it ourselves, which is the way most Americans anyway address it. Right? We don't like legislation. We self-legislate and say, okay, we know what we need to do here to fix it. So I think that's maybe that's what I'll say here.
Yeah, I think that, it has definitely, there's been some, Norway, which I think was the first country to implement the quota system. There was some backlash because I think they pushed many, I think they call them the golden skirts. They put a few women on so many boards that it didn't really achieve. Maybe today it's better, but it initially didn't achieve what they wanted to, achieve. So, so being mindful of the time, I wanted to ask you, in terms of State Street, and you talked a little bit about your journey, but any other things that you did in sort of closing thoughts about putting diversity on the agenda, or anything we missed that you feel would be really important about this topic?
Yeah, and I think the only thing I would say is you have to be patient. You can't expect it to change overnight. I think the one thing I would say is that, we at State Street have been doing this for a long time, and we had goals, and the goals are coming to an end, and it may or may not. I don't know. I'm not part of the goal setting process or the trigger process. But what I think is very important is that we have to understand that it takes a village, and it takes more understanding, and it takes time and training. And so as we look at this journey, the other thing I also want to say is just being part of the whole diversity initiative within SSGA or within State Street has helped me understand what companies need to go through, because on the implementation side, we know how challenging it is. As a manager, I know that if I have to help support those goals, I should be hiring a female candidate. But eventually, what I want on my team is the best candidate. And but I do look for female candidates as well as male candidates. I just look for the best, and I eventually hire the best performer or person who I believe will be the best fit on my team. And I think that flexibility every manager wants and every firm wants, because eventually all of us want to hire the best talent.
Well, and you know what, I'll close with a comment that at the time she was 16-year-old daughter said to me. She said, I want to get the job. I don't want to get the job because I'm a girl, but I don't not want to get it because I'm a girl. So it's always the best person for the job. You just hope that, you're not sort of discriminated against because you're a woman. So it's been a great pleasure to have you, and I really enjoyed this conversation. I am sure our listeners have, and appreciate your amazing insights, and thank you again.
Thank you so much, Patricia.
Thank you for being here, and we'll sign off for this week, and appreciate all of the information.
Thanks.
All right.